like when the engine suddenly rolled back and I heard the turbines go. It was sudden, complete, symmetrical, both sides together. It felt as if the forward momentum of the airplane had nearly stopped in midair. It felt as if the bottom had fallen out of our world. And my body responded in a very normal human physiological way to this sudden stress. I could feel, I was aware of it as it was happening. My pulse, my blood pressure spike, shoot up. I sensed my perceptual field narrow because of the sudden life-threatening stress. My first conscious thoughts, I remember vividly, and I understand that they're typical in situations like this. My first thought was, this can't be happening. Followed immediately by, this doesn't happen to me. In other words, all my flights are more or less routine. For 42 years, I have never been so challenged in an airplane I doubted the outcome. I have never faced a situation I didn't think I could immediately resolve. This was completely different. And then I had a third thought that was really more of a realization. It was one of those moments that divides one's life into before and after. I realized that unlike almost every other flight I'd had for 42 years, that this one probably would not end on a runway with the aircraft undamaged. And I was okay with that, as long as I could solve the problem. But I did three things that made the difference. First, I forced calm on myself, a kind of practiced calm that professionals learn to summon up from somewhere within us. And it's not so much calm as it is having the discipline to compartmentalize and focus clearly on the task at hand in spite of the stress. Second, even though this was a novel and unanticipated event for which we had never specifically trained, never in even the most demanding extreme flight simulator training scenarios have we practiced all these things going wrong at once at such a low altitude with so little time. But I could set priorities. I understood the why. And so, because of a lifetime of training experience, I was able to synthesize that, take what I did know and apply it in a new way to, in 208 seconds, solve a problem I'd never seen before. And third, because the workload was so extreme, because the time pressure is so beyond belief, I knew there wasn't time to do everything I really needed to do. But I could set clear priorities. And so I chose to do only the highest priority items, but do them very, very well. And then I had the discipline to ignore everything else as being only potential distractions. And Jeff did the same thing. You know, I can't say enough good about my first officer that day, Jeff Skiles. He also was highly experienced, thankfully. He has 20,000 hours. He had been a captain on the 737, a different type of airplane before all the latest cutbacks and layoffs. Forced him back into the right seat to be a first officer. Couldn't have had a better partner that day or since. We've become like brothers because of the experience that we shared. And, you know, in many ways, life isn't fair. The media aren't fair. I've gotten the lion's share of attention. That's just the way the world works. He hasn't. Neither has the flight attendant crew. Now, Jeff isn't here, but I've spent so much time around Jeff. If he were here, I know exactly what he would say to you and exactly how he'd say it. He'd say, you know, I deserve some recognition too. After all, I'm the one who flew the airplane into the birds and made Sully the hero. Early on, an interviewer asked both of us if, in retrospect, we would have done anything differently on that important day. And of course, I gave my usual pilot technical sort of answer, and I said, the fact that we got so right so quickly under those conditions is a real testament to our training and our experience. And given the outcome, I would be reluctant to change a lot of what we did that frigid January day over the nearly frozen Hudson River. Now, Jeff Skiles, on the other hand, would ask what he would have done differently. He said simply, well, I would have done it in July. So sometimes the simplest solutions are the easiest ones. Our flight attendants were highly experienced, 30, years each or more. And they found themselves in one of the most difficult situations any cabin crew can. And notice, engines out, water landing in January in a river. But their training kicked in. Our air traffic controller, I can't say enough about, Patrick Hart, a wonderful young man. You probably heard the incredulity in his voice. He told me later he had actually heard quite clearly that I said I was going to be in the Hudson, but he just couldn't wrap his mind around the concept. And he was trying desperately to fulfill his professional responsibility to find a way, some way to get me to a runway, anywhere. Even after he could no longer talk to me because the high rises, the skyline of Manhattan was blocking our signal of the radio. He tried to broadcast in the blind, as we say, telling me other options, airports several miles away. Didn't give up, even as he was being relieved by another controller after an event like this, as you can imagine they always do. He refused to get up from his console until he had given his relief a full changeover briefing. And only then could he break down, because he thought he'd failed. He thought we had all perished. He thought that he was going to be the last person to talk to anybody on the airplane. You know, Jeff Skiles and I did a lot of collaboration, but much of it was wordlessly. There wasn't time to have a conversation about it. I had to rely upon him immediately understanding this developing situation as I did. I had to rely upon him knowing what he needed to do because I didn't have time to tell him. You may notice toward the end he begins to do something on his own initiative he knew intuitively to do, to switch his priorities from trying to use the checklist to regain thrust from damaged engines and to begin to help me in judging the height at which to begin the landing by calling out to me airspeed and altitude above the river. I didn't have time to tell him. He knew to do that. Had he been a brand new pilot with 250 hours, he wouldn't have known to do that. We couldn't have had as good an outcome. Experience matters. The passengers themselves behaved admirably. There's so many touching passenger stories. And there's a funny one too. The air temperature that day was 21, the water was 36. Many people had gotten wet. When Newark waterway ferries rescued us, they took us to both sides of the river. One woman who came ashore on the Manhattan side, as I did, was being checked by the EMTs, the emergency medical technicians. They were asking her, can you feel your fingers, can you feel your toes, or do you have the effects of hypothermia? And her response was, I'm used to this. I'm from Fargo, North Dakota. My first phone call was not to my wife, it was to my company to tell them from my perspective what had happened. That we had 155 people, total passengers and crew, that we had to account for. That I was sure I'd gotten them off the airplane. I hadn't been able to get a count since we had left the airplane. And that phone call was interesting also. I dialed the number, my phone still worked because I was on my belt, and I'd only gotten wet to about right here. And as I dialed the number to call the airline operations manager, I heard this phone ring 4 or 5 times, and then a very busy sounding man said, "This is Bob." And I said, "Bob, this is Captain Sullenberger." He interrupted me and he said, "I can't talk to you right now. We have an airplane down in the Hudson." And I said, "I know. I'm the guy." And the phone went silent. He couldn't, it was like Patrick Hart, he couldn't quite figure out that the CNN, and then we got down to business, and I told him what I knew. You know, in the weeks and months after this flight, I began to hear from colleagues of mine at the airline, people I had flown with years, sometimes decades before, and they started to tell me what they had begun to call Sully stories of long ago events that I had forgotten, but that they hadn't, because something I'd said, something I'd done, some situation that we had encountered and the way I had handled it had resonated with them, and they remembered them, and they were kind enough to share them with me. And sometimes I was told about an important flight-related safety issue, and sometimes I was simply told about the time that we had arrived at our destination at the gate late one night, and after everyone else had deplaned, there was an elderly passenger who needed a wheelchair, and the person who normally brings the wheelchair down from the terminal was nowhere to be found, and so I went into the terminal and found a wheelchair, brought it down, and pushed her up the jetway into the terminal and handed her off to the agent. My thought process was a very simple one. I've gotten you this far, I'm not going to leave you here now. My colleagues also told me that they weren't terribly surprised by the outcome on Flight 1549 because of the way they had observed me living my life for years before. By leading and building a team, by having integrity, by having courage, by insisting on the highest professional standards. It turns out my reputation had been built one interaction, one person, one day at a time. I think that's likely in each of our lives. In every encounter with another person, there's inherently an opportunity for good, for ill, or for indifference. We just have to choose which is going to be. I tell my daughters, at the end of our lives, I think it's unlikely that we're going to be counting our money or cataloging the deals that we made or the things that we managed to accumulate. I think instead it's more likely we may simply ask ourselves a question. Did I make a difference? My wish for you is that your answer is yes. Thank you.